Welcome to Soul of a Story, a series where we analyze a story's themes and search for the emotional core of the whole experience. Alan Wake is about a lot of things: relationships, self-doubt, art as a whole. Though what resonated to me most about Alan Wake was the battle between reality and fiction. So what is reality? This is Alan Wake. He's a writer. He writes crime stories, wears a tweed jacket, and is from New York City. He also has a loving wife, Alice. They decide to take a vacation to Bright Falls to help with Alan's 2-year stint of writer's block. They mostly get along well, until Alice brings up the only reason she brought him here is so that he can start writing again. Alan was just hoping to clear his mind and pick up writing at a later time, but she wants him to start now. Plus, she planned for him to see some doctor that specializes in helping artists. He's having none of that. He storms out. As he's walking away, his wife screams. Despite the nasty situation he just got out of, he can't help but run to her aid. He comes back to see her sinking towards the bottom of Cauldron Lake. He selflessly dives in to save her. Things get a little weird from this point. He wakes up in his car, missing a whole week of time. He starts to fight bizarre shadow creatures called the Taken, and he finds pages of a manuscript from a story he wrote that he doesn't remember writing. This is where the game goes off the rails, and I don't know about you, but I'm along for the ride. I like a good supernatural story with weird concepts and cool monsters. I'm down to clown with this game. For some reason though, I can't shake the feeling that something's off. Like, yeah, I'm running through the forest, shining my flashlight on bad guys and shooting them. I'm killing a lot of baddies. But is this real? Almost immediately after getting thrown into the weird side of this game, I couldn't help but wonder what was actually happening to Alan versus what was going on in his head. That's kind of the whole thing with psychological thrillers. American Psycho, Fight Club, Inception, a big draw to the genre is where you question what's real or not. I went into this game knowing it was a psychological thriller, so I immediately start looking for signs to separate fact from fiction. Alan fighting the Taken could be either. There could be a legit spooky entity in this town that spawns these creatures. Or they really could be just figments of his imagination, twisted versions of people he met in town. I could imagine either being correct. Once you finish Chapter 1 though, more questions are raised than answers given. Alan comes across Sheriff Breaker. He tells her that he was in a car crash and his wife is missing. They were staying in a cabin on Cauldron Lake. Breaker drops a bombshell and says there is no cabin on that lake. The island it was on was destroyed in the 70s. Sure enough, Alan goes there and sees that there is no island. The island he supposedly stayed on just a week earlier is nowhere to be seen. In addition to that, Breaker also asks if he's seen Carl Stuckey. He had. A Taken version of Stuckey was the boss fight for this chapter, and Alan killed him. At this point, I'm like, got it. Alan Wake confirmed schizophrenic, ship it. But much like how I doubted Alan's mental state earlier, I kind of feel something off. Like, this is too obvious. Alan killed Carl Stuckey, and the island he supposedly stayed on with his wife last week hasn't existed since the 70s? I feel like the conclusion you're forced to jump to makes too much sense. This game really is amazing at making you second guess yourself. Every little reveal has you question the reveal that came before. Like the reveal that Alan's agent, Barry, can also see and experience all the dark forces of Bright Falls. I feel like that's a big barrier to jump when debating what's real or fake in a psychological thriller. It's easy to say it's all in a character's head when all the crazy things only interact with them. But once someone else is involved, a wrench is thrown into the whole situation. Barry initially doesn't really believe Alan. He thinks he's kinda off his rocker and needs to get some help. But then, Barry does believe Alan after experiencing one of the Taken attacks himself. The Alan is sane camp makes perfect sense there. there's actually some paranormal force that can be legitimately observed in Bright Falls. The other camp is a bit more complicated. I'm assuming the real Barry was the one concerned for Alan's well-being once he arrived in Bright Falls. But when did that Barry get swapped out for the one that believes in Alan's delusions? Or did he swap out at all? Maybe Barry never actually arrived in Bright Falls in the first place, and Alan's just imagining him this whole time. I don't know, it's all crazy complicated, and the theories are even more complicateder. The wildest moment to me was at the beginning of Chapter 4. The last chapter ended with Alan being tossed into Cauldron Lake. The next one starts with him waking up in a bed, being greeted by his supposedly still missing wife, Alice. Alan's vision blurs and reveals that the figure is actually Dr. Hartman, the doctor Alice brought Alan here to see in the first place. Hartman reveals that Alice is in fact dead. She drowned in Cauldron Lake, and Alan couldn't handle that. He's been suffering from hallucinations and developed an obsession with light and darkness. That his mind has constructed a scenario where his writing is controlling reality. I must say, that's pretty convincing to hear as a player. Alan makes it clear that he doesn't believe him, and is only going along with it for the time being. You, as the player controlling him, might feel inclined to side with Alan. But for some reason, I felt a calling to side with Hartman. I don't know anyone in real life that's gone through intense schizophrenic episodes or anything of the like, but I can't help but think of Alan as a real person here. Like, imagine this happened in real life. Some guy thinks he's in this huge battle between light and darkness and has to save his wife. A doctor would be telling him all the things Hartman is saying right now. And the patient very well might be thinking the things Alan is thinking. The only difference between the two is that we know for certain there isn't a battle between light and darkness in real life. In Alan Wake, though, you get to see it. Whether or not what we see most of the time actually happened is up for debate, but Alan truly believes it. I love that this game confronts you with the potential unreliability of Alan so often. You're kinda with him in a way. You do all these big boss battles as him, but since he's the player avatar, you're seeing the world through his potentially delusional eyes. Despite being in a somewhat safe place, the darkness attacks again, and Alan breaks free. It's around this point of the game where we start to learn about the complicated events leading up to where we are now. Thomas Zane, a writer who previously lived in Bright Falls, has been following Wake throughout his journey, giving him guidance and occasionally protecting him. The dark presence, who had taken the form of Zane's dead partner, was trying to use the power of the lake to escape into the real world. But Zane was able to seal it away with his writing, unfortunately trapping himself in the lake as well. So does that confirm that something strange actually is happening, and it's not just in Alan's head? Because there seems to be a line between this bizarre other dimension and the real world. I guess that makes sense. Well, assuming Zane is real and not just a figment of Alan's imagination, it's hard to figure out where I stand on that. I'll get into it in a moment, but let me set you up first. The beginning of the second chapter is a flashback from 3 years ago, with Alan and Alice talking back in New York City. Alan tells her that when he was a kid, he used to have nightmares, so his mother gave him an old light switch she called the clicker. If Alan were to click it, all the monsters troubling him would go away. A cute little story. Now, 3 years later, Alan is told he needs to get to a place called the Well-Lit Room to receive an important item from a shoebox left by Thomas Zane from when he was still physically alive and not trapped in a lake. Within the shoebox is a piece of paper. A paper that retells Alan's clicker story from when he was a kid. The final lines say that, 30 years later, he stands at the edge of Cauldron Lake, clicker in hand, and jumps in. The clicker is also in the box. Zane wrote this clicker into existence. Just what is the deal with these two? There's obviously some parallels with them, like how they're both writers and both of their partners fell into Cauldron Lake, but I can't quite work out their relationship. Is Zane a figment of Wake's mind? Is Wake a figment of Zane's mind? Is either real? Okay, one of them is probably real, but they seemingly both have narrative control of the events going on here. Alan didn't know what would be in the box here, but Zane did, and it's the clicker no less. Think about the idea of the clicker. It's a device that was given to Alan when he was a kid. When he'd click it, all the monsters would go away. But of course, monsters in a child's nightmare aren't actually real. Kids only think they're real. And so long as little baby Alan thought the clicker was real, it would do its job at defeating all the creatures. It's kinda like a placebo, where it has as much power as you let it have. This real device is given fictional powers. And now, 30 years later, Alan has to rely on it again. What other way could his story end? You can't defeat the dark presence with bullets. He has to defeat it with the belief in the mythos he set up for himself. This clicker will annihilate any monster he comes across. And so it does. Alice is released from her lakey prison. Alan, though, is possessed and trapped in the dark place, whatever that means. That's the end of the base game, but 2 DLC episodes were released. They don't progress the plot forward a whole lot, but you do get to see more of the dark place. It's basically just another dimension where landscapes shift and reality warps around as it pleases. The last DLC ends with Alan at his typewriter, right where he was at the end of the base game. Only this time, he's joined back with his rational self, and can write a new story. Return. So, that's heavy. I'll admit, I'm not the best when it comes to parsing what's going on in crazy stories like this. Plus, I haven't played American Nightmare, the sequel, or even Control yet. I don't have Alan's full story. But for a long time, this was all there was to Alan Wake. And as a singular experience, I think it has a lot to say. But most meaningful to me was Alan's struggle to keep his sanity. That moment where Hartman tries to convince Alan that he's having delusions after his wife died, that kinda stuck with me. Regardless of whether or not he actually fought the dark presence, he's really going through the ringer. Though, honestly, I don't know if it's even worth trying to figure out whether or not Alan really did physically go through the events of the game. I think the opening lines in the intro are particularly relevant here.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one. The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and is what we'll remember in the end.
I kinda like that as a mission statement for the game's story. Why else would the writers literally open the game on that? To give too many answers to a story's mystery takes away some of its longevity. I started to listen to the director's commentary. It was hosted by Sam Lake, one of the game's writers. He literally starts it off by saying he's excited to talk about things he feels like shouldn't really be talked about. Because now that the game has been out for a while, the players own it. We all have our own theories, and each is just as valid as another. Even him, one of the writers for the game, says all he has are theories. He says maybe he didn't see what the story was fully about back then. I stopped listening to the commentary there. I thought back to the game's opening lines, about how, in a horror story, there can be no answers to the victim's questions, and there shouldn't be any. At first, I wanted to figure out whether Alan was having intense mental problems or not. I desperately wanted closure. But then I realized, this is a game about having questions. Alan has tons of questions himself about what's real and fake in his own life, and we have questions about the story itself. But importantly, crucially, those questions cannot have answers. The truths I crave will stay in the shadows, because once I shine that flashlight on them and figure out what they are, the story becomes finite. The creature that is the story dies. The temptation to find the answer must always be there, though. You must always want to search for it, but never be able to find it. And with Alan Wake, you never will. After all, it's not a lake. it's an ocean. Check out either of these videos up next. I'm probably gonna check out all the other Remedy games in the future, but it might be a bit. With Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on the horizon, I'm gonna be grinding out Final Fantasy videos soon. Get subscribed to see those. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.